Hello and welcome to a new interview on Probation and Community Sanctions and Measures. Hallo und willkommen zu einem neuen Interview über die ambulante Resozialisierung von Straftätern. Today in English language with German subtitles. Heute in englischer Sprache mit deutschen Untertiteln. What do offenders need in order to desist from crime in the future? Everybody knows prisons, but prisons in many cases are not the right means to reach this goal. There are alternatives. Today we travel to Liverpool in England to meet Steve Pitts. Steve was head of international relations and justice development at the UK Ministry of Justice in London until he retired in 2015. Since then, he's been active as a consultant in criminal justice. He is the international ambassador for the Confederation of European Probation, CEP, and he's still active in many institutions and organizations that deal with probation and community sanctions worldwide. In the first part of the interview, we talk with Steve about his beliefs, his convictions, and about the question why he devoted his professional life to criminal justice. In the second part of the interview, Steve explains us more about which international organizations and institutions are relevant for the field of probation and community sanctions. If you appreciate the interview, leave us a like and subscribe to the channel. I am Joe, and I would say, let's go. Okay, hello Steve.
Hello.
Very good
Joe.
to meet you here in Liverpool today. We are both not from Liverpool. You live in Oxford, you told me, but we happen to be in Liverpool both of us this week. We want to talk about a topic that's, I think, relevant for most people who are in probation in Germany, but also internationally.
Yes.
What kind of international organizations do we have in that field? What are the most relevant recommendations on an international level in probation? And you're very experienced in that field. I hope I'm allowed to say that. You're already 73 years old and you have a very long-standing professional experience in international work. And you're, among other things, you're a CEP ambassador,
yes.
So you still work worldwide. And
yes.
So you're the perfect person to get to know something or learn something about international organizations and relevant international work in probation. But before we start to talk about this, these things about organizations and recommendations, we want to talk about you as a person. Who's Steve Pitts? What are your beliefs and convictions? How did your professional career develop? And what's the driving force for you to, at an age of 73, still be active in probation and travel around the world and move forward a lot of things? So that's what we want to start with. So my first question would be, could you tell us a little bit about, you just talked about it, maybe also what's so good for you to be in Liverpool, but also what your childhood looked like, how you developed as a young person in the UK, and what made you interested at the end in becoming a social worker and also a social worker in the special field of criminal justice.
The field of criminal justice. Yes, certainly, Joe. Well, first of all, thanks very much indeed for the opportunity to speak, and I think this is a wonderful and very interesting series, and I'm very happy to be a part of it. And yes, a kind of coincidence that we're in Liverpool, because Liverpool actually was formative in a couple of ways in my early years, and I attended university in Liverpool, and that was a long time ago. That was 50 years ago, more than 50 years ago. And actually the reason I came to Liverpool, just a little sidetrack, but I think you'll see the reason for it, is that I liked the Beatles. The Beatles were just starting out, no, they were more than they were well known by that point that I came here. And there was a balance of universities, and Liverpool was a very good university for my topic, which was geology.
Okay,
it was geology, totally different from the topic we're discussing today. But the reason I came to Liverpool was the Beatles, and because we were meeting here just yesterday, I took the opportunity to do something I hadn't done before, which was to visit the childhood homes of two of the Beatles, Paul McCartney and John Lennon. And that's relevant because those homes are preserved just as they were in the 50s and the 60s. And you know, we don't have many opportunities actually in life really to find ourselves just in that environment that we were in 50, 60 or so years ago. But that was the case. So it really took me back, and you know, the furnishings, the description by the guides of the lifestyle and so on were very much as they were in my case. I grew up in a city called Bath. It's a nice city in the south of England.
You also said you're not from a very rich environment. But
indeed, my parents were not well off. They weren't impoverished, they weren't poor, but you know, most families didn't have a lot in those days. Certainly ordinary families like my own. And my father worked very hard. My mother worked very hard too, and you know, money was a little bit tight. But the strange thing was, among many things really, I think I became quite aware of class, you know, and I don't really know about the rest of the world, but I do know that in Britain at that time, class was very much something something very evident.
But didn't it also usually predict the way you go from an educational point of view? So it wasn't, you know, common that people from that background would have a university degree at the end, is it?
No, and I'm the first person, so far as I know, in my family that went to university. But my parents, they had quite a social conscience, I would say, social awareness, and they were foster parents. They were looking after young children. My mother worked as a kind of home help. She worked to help a rich, well-off family. So I had that contact with a very well-off family. But my parents were also aware that there were poorer families still, much poorer than us, and we were kind of somewhere in the middle, in a sense, you know. And I think I became aware of these strata, and they were much more evident, I think, in those days than they probably are now.
So, but obviously you were successful at school, and you could...
I was successful at school. I'd made a decision to do something scientific. I applied and came to Liverpool University because of the Beatles. But here, you know, I studied geology, but I had a subsidiary topic, and the subsidiary topic was geography. And I found myself very much attracted to what broadly was called, and probably still is, human geography. The politics of geography, the social dimensions, the culture of geography and so on around the world. And by the time I finished university, I'd really moved a little bit more towards that field. And I questioned whether I wanted to be a geologist and decided not to be. And something else, talking about my parents, my mother was a volunteer. She was a probation volunteer.
Okay, that's interesting.
We also had a very large prison near us, Dartmoor Prison, which, if you're British, is quite notorious. It's a very well-known prison. Very old. And of course, as young people, we wondered what was happening inside that prison. And my mother became a volunteer, and we got to hear a little bit about what was happening inside that prison. There was also a television program called The Probation Officer in the 60s.
Never heard of it. Okay.
Yeah, and very well regarded, and you can still find descriptions of it online. But I think it was a balanced program, you know, and there was the probation officer being very kind of sensible and mature, but also taking account of the needs of the person, the people they were working with, and trying to assist them. And of course, our we used to say then that we would advise, assist and befriend, and that was the purpose of the probation service, and I was attracted to it.
Okay.
So for all those reasons I came into I trained to be a probation officer.
Yeah, but then you studied social work, wasn't it? Or was that?
Well, it was a social work course, but with a probation option.
Okay.
So the field placements were probation. We learned also about criminal justice, and although there were other people on the course who were studying to be.
But that wasn't in Liverpool, was it?
No, that was in Plymouth. That was down in Devon when my parents had moved down there.
Okay.
By that point.
Okay.
Yes, so there we are. So that kind of shift into the world of probation.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. What I ask everybody I talk to is,
Yes.
maybe it didn't have any relevance for your decision to study social work or probation, but it's interesting anyway. Do you have any personal experience as being a criminal offender?
No, I don't.
No, you don't.
No.
Okay.
Nothing worth speaking of.
Okay, and what about being a victim of crime?
Yeah, a couple of times. Yes, a couple of times. Once a street robbery, another time a burglary.
Where was that? The street robbery?
Both of those were in London. Quite a few years ago now, 20, 30 years ago, probably more than that actually. But yes, I mean they were pretty upsetting experiences at the time.
Did that affect your work or your perception?
Well, I was pretty angry at the time, pretty annoyed. But I think there's a bigger picture really, and despite my anger at having been having had things taken from me. I don't think that stopped me looking at the whole picture, as I would say, of individuals, of society, of how we need to reduce crime so far as we possibly can. But to do that, we need to be aware of all of those complexity of factors that come to play. Maybe there's an individual's decision somewhere at the point of committing an offence, but there are a whole lot of other things that go on.
That was when you already were a probation officer.
I was already a probation officer.
Okay. But coming back to this victim experience, were there any criminal procedures involved? Did the people get caught who assaulted you?
I don't think they were able, so far as I'm aware, the police weren't able to identify the perpetrators in either case. As I say, one was a burglary, they never found that person, and the people who committed the street robbery disappeared very quickly. It was night time.
But it didn't very deeply affect you in the end?
I wouldn't say deeply affect me. It affected me, of course. Especially being robbed. It's a personal, a personal violation of a sort. Unpleasant sort. But I don't think it's changed really greatly significantly the way that I think about work.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's an interesting question because from victim support organizations, especially not always victims of crime themselves, but we are challenged, with too liberal approaches to
indeed, and I understand that very well. And of course, we always want to prevent crime, and that's one of the reasons I came into the job.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. And then you started as a probation officer in London after you studied in Plymouth right away, and I think you were on that job for almost 20 years.
In London?
Yeah.
Something like that. Yes, that's right. I was a probation officer in Lambeth, which is, I suppose you could use the term an inner city London, particularly going back, almost 50 years. Yeah. Lambeth was. By and large, not a wealthy part of London. In fact, much of it is really quite poor. I was located quite close to. My office was located quite close to an area known as Brixton. what probably is still amongst the most serious civil disturbances the country has seen.
It's a carnival thing. Huh?
No, carnival's another part of carnival. By and large, is great, but because there are offences there, as there were this year. No, the civil disturbances in Brixton were of a different kind of order, of a few days actually of fighting between people, many of whom were from ethnic minorities, a very poor community. Street to street fighting with the police. It was a major shock, I think, to the whole country. It's certainly a shock to...
When was that?
So it was around about 1980.
Okay.
And then there was a smaller scale repeat a year, about one or possibly 2 years later, but about 1980. So I'd been a probation officer for about 4 or 5 years in London. Well aware, of course, of tensions and difficulties in the city, various communities. But, the funny thing was, just another slight aside about the way we worked in the probation service, and, I think we were doing a reasonable job. It's not a criticism, it's just a statement of fact. Our offices were sort of located around in the nicer parts of the city, of the borough by and large. And we didn't have an office downtown, as it were. And so we established one. And we established a great office, the Brixton Community Team. It was called the Community Team. And we worked with a lot of volunteers, and they were essential, really, to our ability to do the job. We worked one-to-one, as probation officers do. We wrote reports to the court, and we managed, supervised people in the usual way. But we also ran a lot of group work courses, formal group work, although we didn't really have structured cognitive behavioural programs in those days, but we still talked about the issues that were affecting people and offending and so on. We also did a lot of informal, active group work too. So we took people out on hikes in the mountains and camping trips and all sorts of things like that, organised sports. Often with the local authority. We also involved the police. Actually, we had a very close working relationship with the police. Often shared in each other's activities. So it was a really good, I think, example of working in a different way. And the community element was about community building and about getting to know communities and all sorts of different ways. So that was quite it operated a little bit like a community hub, and nowadays we've come back to having community hubs, and they're regarded as a very good way of working in the UK or in England and Wales.
You just used a keyword. I would like to ask you a little bit more about you. You said we had no cognitive behavioral programs at that time. If you ask me, I think what you just described, community work, the personal relationship between probation officer and client is, in my view, much more important. Which role do you think have programs and especially cognitive behavior, but other programs we have in probation which place would you give those programs, and which place would you give like the work as a person?
It's a good question, and in a sense, kind of who knows? I don't think the evidence tells us completely, but we do know that cognitive behavioural programs can be effective. We see the results, but they're also very time intensive. It's not realistic to deliver them to the majority of people unless we have a huge increase in resources. And in any case, they only deal with one aspect of offending. Programs can have various elements and so on, but by and large, they're about the individual and getting the individual to think and pause and have a different perspective and change the way he behaves and so on, and that's all very good. But the quality of time you spend with someone, the fact that they can trust you or believe that you have their interests at heart, supporting people to make the contacts and connections they need for work, for example, or somewhere to live, or mental health treatment, drug misuse treatment, alcohol treatment, whatever it might be. They're all absolutely vital, and perhaps we may come back to that subject a little bit later. But as I said earlier, I think our work is very complex, very multifaceted. One of the reasons Why? Because I'm sure you want to know why I'm still working at this stage. It's one of the reasons why. It's interesting, and there's still things to do.
Okay. So, and after having done quite a few years of practical work, and you also had leading positions in the probation services you worked, you decided to take up a job at not the Ministry of Justice, Ministry of Interior in the first place, and you were a resident twinning advisor in an international project.
Yes, yes.
So why did you say I leave practical work and I go in that direction?
Yeah, that's also a good question, which I can't say I've thought about for a long time. But I suppose I thought that working centrally might have, well, it's an opportunity to have an impact in a different way, rather than working with individuals. And I've been doing that for more than 20 years. I'm running a team as well, being a manager of a team, which was fascinating, a wonderful job. I think working centrally, just an opportunity to try and make some differences on another level. And my first responsibility with what was then the Ministry of Interior, or Home Office as we called it, responsible for prisons and probation, was to do with partnerships. And secondly, with quality and management. That was an interesting project. And as a part of that, we were beginning to look at effective practice. And absolutely right, and in a way a bit bizarre that we hadn't before. And
you immediately started to look at effective practice internationally, or was that
at that stage? No. At that stage, it was UK. Canada had probably set the lead at that point in terms of looking at what we called what works at that stage, which had a lot of cognitive behavioural components, risk assessment, and so on. And that's where we were at that point, 20, probably nearly 30 years ago now. So that's what we were focused on, and we took our lead from Canada. So that was international in a sense. I met some Canadian experts who I'm still in contact with these days. But the Netherlands were also, I think, very, very focused on this kind of work too. So we had a lot of connection with the Netherlands at that point. So I began to see that there was a whole world of probation and prisons. Forget about prisons. Going on out there. And it was after that I saw an opportunity to work as what was called a twinning advisor with the European Commission. And
that was in Armenia, wasn't it?
No, that was Bulgaria.
Bulgaria.
So I worked in Bulgaria. I was resident in Bulgaria for 2 years in the early part of the century, from about 2005. So we're going back about 20 years now. Helping to establish the probation service in Bulgaria. And incidentally, in terms of high points, I would say that work in Brixton in the community unit, and then working in Bulgaria to high points really in my career. I mean, everything has been interesting, and I don't think there's really anything I regret. But inevitably there are high points, and I think something about the intensity, the richness of those posts, that sense of purpose, and fantastic to work in Bulgaria. Wonderful period of time professionally.
And these small initiatives and projects at some point led to founding an international department at the ministry level for England and Wales. And who initiated that, or how did that come about? Because
it was probably more or less my idea. I mean, it's rare that ideas are just only one person. There must have been some conversations and ideas and exchanges. But and certainly I remember talking to other colleagues, some of whom had been working with me in Bulgaria, and I think the first step actually was working in Bulgaria with the European Union, European Commission. I had a growing awareness of the European picture. And actually, we were part of a team, a multinational team in Bulgaria. So I was responsible for probation development. Actually, another colleague from England and Wales was responsible for prison enhancement in Bulgaria. But we had other people from Spain, from France, from all sorts of countries really in Europe, but all working together as part of a team on different aspects of justice. And how fascinating to put that together. And because they all had contributions, absolutely, that was wonderful to see that. And Austria was another country very involved in work in Bulgaria at that time. As that piece of work came to an end, I realized that we weren't very involved in England and Wales. I shouldn't say, I might not have known that if there had been some initiatives, but by and large, we weren't very involved in European multilateral learning or research projects. And there are these projects in Europe, there were and there still are, mainly led by the European Commission, or paid for by the European Commission, led by the European Commission, paid for by the European Commission or European Union. And I wanted to try to bring together people from different countries to work together on some of the challenges that we were facing at that point of time back home here. And those challenges were around family violence, domestic family violence, drug misuse, generally thinking about cognitive behavioral programs, as we mentioned earlier, and seeing if we could understand them better and develop them more effectively. And there were other strands as well. So essentially what the idea was to try to take a European view on what was working in probation and to some extent in prisons
sounds
as well.
reasonable, but the one thing is that what sounds reasonable, and the other thing is what can you really realize on a level of ministry. So did people say or the minister at that time or whoever was in charge to make decisions, did they say it's a good idea and you get money to form a new department, or did they say good idea but you have to see where you get your own funds for this?
I'm not sure that ministers were involved in the decision to set up the international team, although from time to time we certainly spoke to ministers and sent submissions, and there was no disagreement, no opposition to that. It would depend, of course, on the government of the day. That government had already initiated some interesting wanted to invest in the probation service a few years previously. At the time when I'd been working in the Home Office, there was a crime reduction program that also, I think, introduced me to the advantages of a concerted focus on gathering evidence. So we ran a number of pilot programs that were independently evaluated, also extremely interesting. My focus, incidentally, was linking prison and probation, reintegration, and that's still, I think, one of the key issues. Yeah. But I think it was an internal but high-level decision to. It was probably at the top of the Prison and Probation Service that we said the directors would have said, this is something we need to do. We need to be cooperating with other European countries. We need to be learning from them. We need to be sharing our expertise. But actually, Joe, our team had probably three main strands. One of those was to receive inbound visitors, study visits. Second was to develop cooperative research projects where we would learn from universities and practice across Europe. And the third strand was building capacity, supporting the development, particularly of probation, because that was my background, but actually, no, it was a prison and probation team, so we were working with prisons too. I'm not a prison expert, but we have other people, of course, who were. So we were working to support those developments in other parts of the world. So that was after having worked in Bulgaria, setting up the international team.
Okay, now we're drifting a little bit away from your personal motivation.
We are.
So
yes.
Maybe as a last question for this part, I'd like to ask you. I mean, you've been around the world. in lots of different projects affecting prison and probation. You've worked for international organizations. What was the most rewarding thing in doing that for you personally?
I think probably learning very clearly and firmly that there is a world of probation, quite literally. And if we focus only on what's happening in our own country, I mean that can still be very meaningful, certainly can be. But it's enriching to know that there are people in Asia, in Africa, in South America, in North America, everywhere, who are thinking about the same questions, trying to answer the same questions, So we're all kind of in it together, and we can all learn from each other.
I have the same feeling, and we'll come back to that when we talk about the structures and organizations worldwide in our second part. So I make a cut here. And okay, so we start the second part of our interview concerning international organizations, recommendations, and just to give you a little idea about why I think this could be interesting for the people who watch this video today, at least in Germany. I like to take part in quizzes, and there's a daily quiz of one of the large political magazines in Germany, Der Spiegel, and I do it every day. And a few weeks ago there was a question about international organizations, and you can, when you answer it, you can also see the results, how many people have answered it correctly or not.
Right.
And there was a question about the Council of Europe, and 60% of the people who took part in that quiz didn't know that the Council of Europe is not an instrument of the European Union. So, and this, throws a light on the knowledge, at least in Germany, about international organization. And this, I think, also refers to people who work in criminal justice and probation, probation officers, but even people who work on quite high level. So what I would like you to do in the first place is to give us, maybe you are very experienced in that field, try to give us a little bit of an overview, on the level of international organizations like the United Nations, Council of Europe and the European Union. What have we got there? What are the relevant recommendations, and what are the relevant more or less organizations of these three international bodies?
Yes. Okay. Well, it's quite a challenge. I'll do my best. Well, you mentioned the Council of Europe, so should we start with the Council of Europe?
Yeah, we start in the middle. That's okay.
Which of course is not the same as the European Commission or the European Union. It has more member states for a start, and we in England and Wales and UK are still a part of the Council of Europe. Well, the Council of Europe, it's important. It's important, really, for us. I think, in a number of ways. I mean, first of all, the Council of Europe produces recommendations or standards for our area of work. The probation rules, for example, 2010 and subsequent amendments and so on. But the probation rules, and they're a little bit like the Tokyo rules from the United Nations. We've come to them in a minute. But the probation rules set out standards and expectations for how probation work is delivered. In terms of organisation, staffing, training, accountability, and also practice, individualised approach, minimum intervention commensurate with proportionality and justice, and so forth. And increasingly, they focus also on some quite detailed areas of practice, which are really very important for us. I think they're looking at the moment on mental health, for example, in probation work. And digital developments, technological developments are another area of keen focus for our national offenders. There are many others. So those standards are one very important area of work. Now you may ask a question, perhaps we may come back to it, about how influential are those, and I think that's a, that's a good question.
We talk about that later, but the first question would be, who are the people who draft these recommendations, and how's the process? Who decides on it at the end?
Well, there's something called the Council for Penological Cooperation, which also has subcommittees, subgroups, and ultimately, I mean, they bring together experts. I mean, the highest level, they are signed off by ministers from all of the member states. But the working level tend to be experts from a range of different countries. I think with the Council of Europe, the experts are appointed as independent experts rather than representing their country. I think that's the case. But there are also organisations like the CEP who are involved. And in the end, you know, it probably comes down to a fairly small group of experts who do most of the groundwork on a topic like mental health or developing the recommendations. Actually, the UK, England and Wales, we had quite a big input into the probation rules. It just so happened that we had a number of professors and practitioners who were, I think, well aware of the European dimension, and were called upon also to support the development of those standards. Also a very well established probation service. I think that was probably a factor as well. So those experts would come together, develop the recommendations. They then go to a wider body where they're approved. Ultimately, they're signed off by at ministerial level, so they become owned by all member states. And incidentally, I mean, perhaps this is a slightly unofficial, informal observation, but I think it can be quite difficult sometimes developing standards that are going to be acceptable to, 40 plus different countries, and there has to be a little bit of trading, and occasionally perhaps the standards are not very in depth for that reason, but on other occasions they are quite in depth and implemented to different degrees by different countries.
To tell you the truth, I don't know it.
No.
Are there any public consultations concerning the drafts of these recommendations?
I mean, they're online in draft form, but I don't think there's a formal process of consultation. There are, however, processes for engaging civil society, but that's through networks and through bodies that have a relationship with the Council of Europe. But that Council of Europe operates at that kind of a formal ministerial national level, and through regional ways of reaching into regions, more lower level than national bodies, but as I say, also a way of involving civil society, NGOs and so on. And that's probably realistically, I think I may be wrong, but so far as I'm aware, that's probably the most realistic way for majority of people to get involved in the work of something like the Council of Europe. But the Council of Europe does other things too that are very helpful for us. It produces the space statistics, annual statistics on prison and probation. And, we're one of the few parts of the world that really has detailed, maybe the only part of the world that beyond an individual country, that has a detailed picture of what is happening in the world of prison and probation, and that's very, very helpful for helping to inform policy. Really useful. So it's through the space statistics that we become aware of net widening, phenomenon of net widening, for example. And now we're aware of it, we may possibly be able to do something about it. Council of Europe also monitors, particularly in relation to prisons and torture. And it has a number of development forums, which, as well, I've really been speaking about those. They feed into the development of the standards and so forth. So quite a range of different activities.
Yeah, and also, as far as I remember, the Council of Europe organizes regular conferences where all the directors of prison and probation are involved.
Indeed they do. Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. That's also extremely important. And that's. I think it is the case that the professional input into the end results of the Council of Europe is pretty intense. It's there are perhaps these core groups of people who study and go into depth on particular topics like mental health, but as you say, the directors come together, and that's also an influential and important body. And so some of those conferences can be quite big too, and bring in all sorts of other people as well. So there's an opportunity to contribute in that way.
Okay, and then you just started to make a link to the United Nations and mentioned the Tokyo rules.
Yeah, well, the Tokyo rules are a little bit like the probation rules, but they're global. They precede the Council of Europe probation rules by a number of years. I think they're more than 30 years old now. And the earliest versions at a global level of trying to pull together some sort of standards about how we work go back even further than that, I think 50 or so years or more. So very well established developments. So, I mean, a little bit like the Council of Europe. Obviously, the structures are different, but you have the ministerial level, you have the working level, working levels too, and you have opportunities for civil society to be involved, and they're quite extensive arrangements for civil societies to be involved in the work of the United Nations. But for our purposes, probably the key body is UNODC, United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime. They happen to be based in Vienna, which means that in that kind of geographical sense, they're a little bit more accessible. They focused for a long time on prisons. I think, true to say, increasingly focusing on probation as well, which is a very good thing, I would say. And they do focus on topics that are developed through a consultation process. And I know a little bit about it because I happen to be a representative in the build-up to the Kyoto Congress. So they bring together people who will help to shape the debate. And I think probably something like half a dozen people from Europe were involved in the process for determining the main focuses of the Congress that took place.
But those were people who were appointed by the governments of member states of the UN, huh?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question because, in fact, I don't think that's the case. I think that most of those experts, in inverted commas, myself, are representing different organizations and bodies, and sometimes themselves. So I was there on behalf of the CEP.
Okay.
Others were there because they represented the user voice or lived experience. Others were there because they had experience of working with volunteers, and in fact I had a role in developing the Volunteer Congress. Might just touch on that too in a minute. So the civil society and network organizations, again, are one of the most, I think, realistic ways of getting involved in that kind of work. And then ultimately it becomes national. So when the Congress itself takes place, each country has a delegation. Actually, in my former role, we spoke earlier about my work for the international team. We had a little bit of input there through that into what happened at national level. But then, yes, that national delegation goes and participates, influences the debate, the ultimate shape of recommendations. And again, there's a ministerial level of involvement too. I think probably foreign ministers, I'm not quite sure actually whether they're foreign ministers or justice ministers, I don't know, possibly it varies. But ultimately they're signed off, those recommendations are signed off at ministerial level. So again, you see, you have this huge process that ultimately results in really relatively tight recommendations, but also a set of, I think they're very interesting because the Kyoto Congress has come forward now with a set of steps which are to do with reducing reoffending. So we know that they now bring together experts from around the world to try to find the very best ways of reducing reoffending. And they talk a lot about rehabilitative prisons, for example, or about the rehabilitative community, which is something I was arguing for when we were preparing for the Kyoto Congress. But the big thrust at the moment is reducing reoffending.
So maybe there are more recommendations to come in the
There will be more recommendations to come in terms of reducing reoffending, but they're pretty broad. You know, they're not about cognitive behavioural programs. That may be a part of it, but they're much wider. They're about involving communities. It's a really very important part of the thrust of the United Nations, the UNODC's work. Yeah. And I could actually just read you one sentence which I think summarises what the next Congress, which I think is going to be in the United Arab Emirates, what it says. And let me see, I think I can find it very quickly. I have it. So let me show you. So this is called the 15th Crime Congress Agenda. Overall theme: accelerating crime prevention, criminal justice, and the rule of law. So those are the overarching priorities. Protecting people and the planet, and achieving the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development in the digital age.
Well, that's very broad.
It's pretty broad. It's pretty broad, but it's also interesting, I think, because you have crime prevention, criminal justice, rule of law. Those are the kind of foundations, really, for their work. But mention of the planet. That's quite interesting, I think.
And where and when is that going to take place?
Well, so this is the 15th one, which I think is 2026. It might be 25. I'm pretty sure it's 2026, and it's in the United Arab Abu Dhabi.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It's broad, but nonetheless, there are important bulwarks there that are that the United Nations is paying attention to. It's thinking about the Sustainable Development Goals as a part of justice, or justice as a part of the Sustainable Development Goals, and about the importance of technology. So, and because of the people that are involved, it's actually, often quite cutting edge.
Okay.
Maybe that you'll be interviewing people who have an input into this too.
Yeah, probably yes. We'll see. But to round up the United Nations, as far as I understood, also from your CV, the United Nations also is involved, or maybe even funds projects in regions. And they do. They have regional organizations that are concerned with prison and probation services, like in the Pacific and Africa.
Yes, they do. So the UNODC has offices in many parts of the world. I've worked with them in Asia. CEP, I think, has engagement at the moment with UNODC, I think, in Central Asia. I'm currently have been for some time, with UNODC in Africa as well. And those are very grounded projects doing targeted work to address justice issues on the ground.
Okay. So the international body that's left is the European Union. I mean, you're not part of the European Union anymore, but I think it's a relevant player, at least in Europe.
Sure, for sure it is, the European Commission and the European Union. Well, one of the great things that the European Commission and the European Union has done is to fund multilateral development projects. And of course, it helps, I believe, currently still helps to support the CEP as well. So those projects address all sorts of different dimensions of probation and prison development. The process is that there are calls for projects. If you're aware of them, and it's important to be aware of them, if you're aware of them, you gather together a consortium you think is going to be a strong consortium of people interested in this topic, and you make your bid, and there you go. And then you're working internationally with a group of other players in the field helping to develop our work. And there are many examples. I mean, at any one point in time, there must be half a dozen or a dozen, or possibly even more, projects involving probation people around Europe, working on matters of common interest, all those topics that you could imagine might be important. Again, we've touched on many of them. It might be education, it might be mental health, it might be digital, it could be all sorts Brussels.
And it's mainly funding from the general direction of justice, but also from other directions.
Yes, I mean there are a number of directorates that fund, and also nations or partners need to put in an element of their own funding as well. But the European Commission contributions are hugely significant, and otherwise this work couldn't proceed. And it's very, very valuable, I would say.
The European Union or the Commission also has some recommendations, even framework decisions that are obligatory for EU members.
Indeed.
Would you think of any recommendations or decisions that are relevant for our field?
Well, the framework decisions on transfer are hugely relevant. Now we're not a part of those, but I was involved in the early discussions and developing those, and I think the prison one, I think we continued in some form or another, but not the probation one. But they're vital, and I think work is still ongoing, really, to try to smooth out the various barriers between movement of people to complete their sentences in the relevant country.
Okay. Yeah, and to complete the picture of international cooperation, it's not only these international bodies that are run by member states, but it's also NGOs, larger and smaller NGOs in the field that are relevant for discussions and development as well. What would you say are the most relevant organizations that you think of, I mean, on a worldwide scale?
Well, we both have a role with the CEP. The CEP is obviously very critical and central in Europe.
The Confederation of European Probation.
The Confederation of European Probation. And the CEP is increasingly, I think, looking at what's happening around the world too, and finding ways to collaborate for the mutual benefit of everybody. Europris, which is a similar organization but focused more on prisons, also has a similar role in Europe. The ICPA, International Corrections Prisons Association, operates globally. I was at their conference only last week.
In Singapore.
In Singapore, people from all across the world. And earlier on in the interview, we said how it's enriching and perhaps also reassuring to know that people around the world are looking at many of the same issues and coming up with solutions. And we also have the World Congress on Probation and Parole, another very important network. And incidentally, these forums provide ways too to be involved in that bigger picture of building decisions and recommendations as well. It's one of the best ways to be involved. And each of those organizations has quite a large number of working groups too. So for anyone who wants to take a step into working internationally, I would say that the working groups of the CEP or the working groups of ICPA provide a very good way into finding out what is happening on that international scale. But the World Congress of Probation and Parole is an important development. Actually, it's not a brand new development. It's been running for about 10 years now, with a conference every 2 years. Last one back in Europe. So we've had two in Europe, London, and now in The Hague. Very successful. Increasing numbers of people involved. And well, they have the possibility, and I think are increasingly thinking strategically about probation or about alternatives to custody, because there's a huge agenda there, I think, still in every part of the world, including our own, including here in Europe, about promoting alternatives, giving them what I think is their rightful, deserved place in the whole sentencing framework. In many countries, some countries doing better than others within Europe, and that's the case around the world. But there are many parts of the world where alternatives are still hardly taken off at all, or they have a very minor role. But what you find is that the people at the conferences, at the international conferences, really want to take the steps to develop the alternatives. And I think this is a growing movement around the world.
Obviously are some differences between the organizations. You talked about the
Indeed.
ICPA is worldwide.
Yes, indeed.
You can get member as an individual or an organization, same with CEP in Europe. The World Congress is different, and also there are similar organizations like the CEP in other parts of the world, aren't there?
There are some, but there are less than you might think. Australia, for example, has one, working across the state, the Australian states. America has one, the APPA, the American Probation and Parole Association. There are fairly early steps in developing a network in Asia, in the ASEAN region, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, I think I got that right, and in Africa, where certainly we're working with UNODC to begin to establish our probation network, and of course all of those hopefully will become twins or whatever for the CEP, and also be a part of the network of the World Congress of Probation and Parole. That's an aspiration.
That would also be your idea for the future. I mean, I know that you have some ideas about how worldwide development should look like maybe in the future in the probation sector.
Yeah. Well, I think first and foremost, certainly very important, there has to be a network, there has to be a way of communicating. If we don't have that way of communicating, then what you find is that there are pockets develop here and there, but we don't have the benefit of learning from each other, or the support that comes from knowing other people are taking steps in the same field.
So, and obviously there are some developments also in the context of the World Congress of Probation, so there are things to come. What I'd like to put the focus on now is that we discuss a little bit about the impact that these international organizations and also the recommendations have on national or regional levels. I mean, my experience, and I talked about that before, at least in Germany, is that it is limited. Although the United Nations, Germany is a member of the United Nations, the Council of Europe, the same. They have all these recommendations. They are not very widely known among practitioners, and even when it comes to lawmaking, in my experience in Germany, it is not always the case that people who draft laws refer to international recommendations and developments. Do you think this is something special in Germany, or would you say this is something you can see in other countries as well? And what would be the reason?
Yeah, I think it's much the same here.
Yeah. In the UK.
In the UK, or in England as well. So we should always distinguish between the jurisdictions here. But it's, so I speak mainly about England and Wales. But yes, it is the case. And I mean, I think that's partly because we have a very well-established probation service, and we're talking about the probation field, which is definitely not to say that we cannot learn from other countries, by the way. But that's nonetheless, I think, a little bit the way that the thinking is. And we have influenced a lot of those. As a well-established service, I think I said earlier, we have influenced a lot of those mechanisms and those recommendations, standards. But what I do see, and incidentally we did some research on this in one of the European projects a few years ago, what we do see is that those standards and recommendations are quite influential with countries that are fairly new to probation.
Yeah, that's true.
They're thinking, I think you know that myself and my colleague Leo Tiggeth have been working on a project on developing probation, and we have this diagram, this infographic, which talks about the different areas of worker probation and how you can develop and sustain it, and these different what we call domains are essentially based on the kinds of recommendations and structures that you see in the Tokyo rules or in the probation rules, so they have an influence there. And I think presenting them in this very user-friendly way is quite a good way of communicating those, and I think they will continue to have influence. But yeah, they're I would say therefore very helpful for those jurisdictions that are planning to take take steps. And then the more specific recommendations, we mentioned often mental health, but there are lots of others, I think are helpful too, because basically what they do is distill current best knowledge. So they're not really saying this is, well, to some extent, they're recommending this is how you do things, but that's really based on sound
I think
practice.
Maybe, it's emerging probation services. That's something you can see in the European development as well. I think the CCP is dominated by smaller countries who are, I think, dependent on international cooperation, because in small countries you can't possibly develop everything on your own. Whereas in like the really large countries like Germany, France, maybe Spain, Italy, UK, it's maybe less relevant because you have your internal discussion with different, academia.
And you have the academic links, and the academics also have something we haven't talked about. Academics also have their international links. Yes.
But I mean, the two of us would agree on the fact that it's always relevant and beneficial to have international cooperation. So what would be your thoughts on the question? How can people who share our view get involved in international cooperation? Because we already talked about it before the cameras were on. You meet the same people
you do meet
again and again. It's certain people who are committed to international cooperation, and that's a small minority.
No, you're quite right, and that I think is a pity, and I think we lose out for that reason. Probably, I think I touched briefly already on the various working groups of the CEP, for example, and of the ICPA. Or of Europris. I think they're one of the best ways to get involved. And once you're involved in those working groups, then those organisations in turn then have their input into the Council of Europe, into the European Commission, into the United Nations, and and can take account, of those deliberations. So perhaps as a very concrete thing to do, I would say get involved with the CEP, get involved with other similar organisations, get involved in their working groups, and
as somebody who comes from a country that's not English speaking, I'm not a native speaker, as are my colleagues. How do you think can we address the language barrier in the future? Because all the discussions are carried out in English language. So
they tend to be these days. They weren't always, I think, but these days they often are. I think it's a good question. Sometimes interpretation is available at different events, but I think you're right, and that's something perhaps to be considered a little bit further. And I don't know whether. I'm thinking off the top of my head, as we say, but whether individual countries might also consider, might also focus on some issues nationally, and then feed that also into the international bodies. That may be a little bit of a way of helping to overcome that important point of language.
Maybe also artificial intelligence can help in the future.
Oh, well, it's getting better. It's getting much better, actually, recently. Indeed, yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Steve, for the information you gave us so far on international bodies and recommendations. And now I only have 2 questions left I ask every interview partner. And the first question would be, if you had to tell us in one sentence what offenders need in order to desist from crime in the future, what would you say?
In one sentence?
If it's possible.
Well, one sentence with a proviso, which is that everybody is different. Okay. Perhaps it's an obvious thing to say, but I think it's an important thing to say.
Yes.
Maybe I can distinguish between people who have been to prison and those who have not too, because I think that gives another layer of complexity and issues to be resolved. And well, listening to people with lived experience or lived expertise, I mean, maybe we can summarize it as something like, summarize a very complicated picture as something like hope and opportunity. Hope requires us as probation people to be enabling, to be encouraging, is a part of the supervisory process, and opportunity, it's about connections, it's about society accepting people, it's about permitting belonging. Both of those have got a lot of implications for probation organisations and probation leaders as well, in terms of enough staff who can build the relationships, have time to do that, and staff who also have time to build the connections in the community. That's why, you know, it's so interesting for us in Europe to see what's happening in Singapore or Japan, where the organisations, probation, prison organisations, have that big impetus to involve communities and to help to give second chances. Something like that.
Okay, thank you very much. A very long sentence, but a meaningful sentence.
I hope there weren't any full stops, maybe just commas.
Only commas. Okay, thank you. And the second question I always ask, that's related to the offender side, of course, is the victim side. What would you, in one sentence, say, what do victims need most in order to find closure or to lead a good life after what had happened in the future?
Yeah. Can I answer that from a personal perspective? I haven't been, I'm fortunate not to have been a victim of any really very serious crime. But what I can say is that the reaction of those around me, beginning with the police actually, if the police take it seriously, that's a help. If the system takes it seriously, that's a help. But then friends and family, and also, though you often don't know, what is the offender's reaction? And I would like to think that there's an acknowledgement of the hurt caused on the part of the person that committed the crime. So that's what comes to my mind.
Yeah, thank you very much, Steve. And
you're welcome.
For the answers to the last two questions, but for the whole interview. Thank you very much.
I hope it's helpful or interesting.